Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be doing another player review. And we started from the top and are now working our way down this list. Just in the previous two videos, we were talking about two players who had slightly exceeded my expectations for the season, and now we've really arrived at the players who were just kind of mediocre, kind of did what they were expected to do. And I should note at this point that my expectations for these types of videos are actually rather low. For instance, if I were to take Evander Kane, who was the first player on this list with the grade of an A, I would say that I was expecting a 20 goal, 50 point season from Evander Kane over an 82 game pace, and he far exceeded those expectations, which is why he got an A. It's also why in my previous video about John Leonard, I said I was really only expecting him to try and be a consistent NHL player, playing a good amount of games, which is why he ended up just barely getting over the mark of a C. So now we're getting to these players here who my expectations were particularly low, and they just barely managed to meet them. And the first one of those players is Kevin Labanc. It just feels as though that Labanc has been in the same position for the past few years, almost his entire career, honestly. It just feels as though he's kind of just stagnate. I remember his first NHL season, and I remember thinking, if he could just get a bit more disciplined and a bit better defensively, and maybe a bit more, out there offensively and a bit more consistent offensively, maybe shoot the puck a bit more and a bit more creative on the power play, something could really happen for Kevin Labanc. He can take the next step forward. And now 5 seasons later, we're kind of just saying the exact same thing. Again, it's that discipline, it's the defensive zone, it's taking a few more shots, it's the power play creativity. It just feels as though he hasn't really developed a ton over his career. And so coming into this season, I had the expectation that he would do pretty similarly to how he's done throughout his career, and that's almost exactly what ended up happening. What's most interesting is that some people will look at his career stats and say, well, that's not necessarily the case. Remember that 18-19 season, he had over 50 points, but it should be noted that I don't know if there's that much of a difference between 2 seasons ago Labanc in 18-19 and this season's 2021. I feel like the main difference is what happened around him. Obviously, the Sharks were significantly better team in 18-19 compared to this season, so that's one thing. The second thing is that Labanc has been thrusted into this sort of first, or I guess you could say just top 6 role on this team because of the Sharks, offensive depth, or I guess lack thereof, compared to 2 seasons ago in the 18-19 year, where he was able to stick on the third line with players like Joe Thornton and Marcus Sorensen and just abuse other teams' third lines and third defensive pairings. Now facing up against the top competition, he's no worse than he was 2 years ago. He's no better than he was 2 years ago. He's just playing against tougher competition, so naturally his point totals are going to suffer because of that. So as we move into the statistics here, he played 55 games this season, played all but 1 game, 12 goals on the year, which would put him on pace for 18 in a full season, 16 assists, which would put him on pace for 24 assists in a full season, and 28 points, which would be 42 points in a full year. Pretty decent, and pretty much, as I said, as expected from a borderline top 6 player like Kevin Labanc is, right? There were still the occasional defensive issues this season. Obviously, the power play, it still is just the classic Kevin Labanc where he gets the puck along the wall and then tries the behind the back pass back to the point, something that worked back in the 18-19 season when teams weren't used to it, but now is being read like a book every single time, and yet he continues to do it every single time. Not going to put the entire power play failures of the San Jose Sharks onto Kevin Labanc, but I'm sure his stagnation and always doing that similar play is not helping in that regard. And as we move on to the penalty minutes here, we see that again he is not necessarily the most disciplined player on the San Jose Sharks with his 31 penalty minutes. This isn't, tops on the team. Obviously, there's Evander Kane, there's Brent Burns above him, but he is one of the highest penalty minute forwards for the San Jose Sharks. The good news is that at the very least, he is drawing a lot of penalties. So as such, in terms of net penalties, which is, of course, penalties drawn minus penalties taken, he is a +3, so that's not too bad. But imagine if if he could be more of a Ryan Donato style player where he's still drawing those tons and tons of penalties, but he's actually taking significantly less. Especially one of the worst things about Kevin Labanc is not just that he's racking up penalty minutes, but it's just the type of penalties that he finds himself taking. There are a good amount of offensive zone penalties, which is something that really is, grinds the gears of NHL coaches and NHL fans alike, because you're the team that is supposed to have the advantage in the offensive zone. The other team is supposed to be the ones being forced to take penalties in their own defensive zone to prevent your team from scoring. And so when your team takes an offensive zone penalty, you can just kill the momentum from your team and potentially even gift wrap a goal for the opponents. So it's definitely something that Kevin Labanc needs to sort out. A lot of them are also just classic hookings or slashings that easily can be cleaned up. But as I said, we've been saying this for years about Kevin Labanc, and it hasn't really happened. It hasn't really been the case yet. So maybe this is just something that's part of his game. Maybe he gets too caught up in the moment and tries to do just way too much and ends up being forced to take these penalties. Moving on to his plus minus. So I decided, in my previous videos, I would either discuss penalty minutes or plus minus, whichever was most interesting. But here for Kevin Labanc, I thought both were rather interesting. The penalty minutes, of course, just to talk about his, lack of discipline that has been noted throughout his entire career. But the plus minus, it is a -9, which obviously doesn't seem particularly strong. And Kevin Labanc is not the best defensive player. He did benefit a good amount from being on a line very consistently with Logan Couture, who, of course, is a very solid defensive player. But the main reason why I wanted to look at his plus minus is because it is in stark contrast to what his plus minus was last season. So of course, the Sharks were a slightly worse team last season. They were third last in the league in the previous year. This year, they were only seventh last in the league. It's not really that much, actually sixth last if I'm not mistaken. It's actually not that much of an improvement, but then again, whatever. But the point is that in the previous year, Labanc was a -33, which is unimaginably awful. He was the lowest in the NHL of a player who wasn't on the terrible Detroit Red Wings by far. -33. It's just hard to imagine how a player even gets to that point in terms of plus minus. Yes, this is not a very reliable stat. Yes, this can be a bit luck based, where sometimes you're just on the ice in a goal that had no effect on you, and thus you end up getting a minus. Yes, the Sharks were not a good team last season, but a -33 is very, very bad. That was actually -11 more than any other, or I guess less technically, -11 less than any other player on the San Jose Sharks that year. So the fact that he managed to improve that to a -9 this season goes to show that yes, maybe Logan Couture had an effect on him, but also just in general, even though Labanc's defensive game has never been fantastic, it was likely still better than what it was last year. And finally, talking about time on ice, 16 minutes and 25 seconds. Not too bad for a player who essentially gets zero shorthanded ice time. He's a player who is somewhat consistently finding himself on the first power play unit. And I say somewhat because the Sharks were juggling their power play unit a lot this season, as it was struggling a lot this season. And he's also getting a decent bit of even strength ice time because he is that pseudo top 6 forward for the San Jose Sharks. And just in general, throughout looking at all of these statistics, it just goes to show that it was a very mediocre, very average, and very expected year from Kevin Labanc, which is why by the end of this, I ended up giving him the grade of a C. Class dismissed.